So let me start out with a modern parable, if you like. Once upon a time, there are these two brothers, and they shared adjoining farms. And for over 40 years, they worked side by side, sharing equipment and helping each other out whenever needed. Then one day, a rift developed. It began with a small misunderstanding, and it grew into a major difference, and finally it exploded into an exchange of bitter words followed by an inordinate time of angry, defiant silence. One day, the eldest brother, Pete, was out in his field when a truck pulled up, and out jumped a man who approached Pete carrying a carpenter's box. "I'm looking for a few days of work," he said. "Perhaps you have a few small jobs that I could do for you?" "Well, yes, I do," said Pete. "See that creek down there? It's the border between my brother's farm and mine. My brother keeps it nice and deep to stop me from setting one foot on his beloved farm. And, well, I've obliged him over all this time. I want you to take that timber over there by that barn and build me a new fence, a real tall one. I want to make sure that I don't have to look at my stinking brother's farm no more." The carpenter was glad to have the work. "Not to worry, I understand. Just point to me where your post hole digger is, and I'll get started and get the job done." So the carpenter set out working. Meanwhile, Farmer Pete drove into town to the cattle auction, and when he returned at sunset, he was shocked to see what the carpenter had done. There was no fence. Instead, the carpenter had built a bridge, and walking across it was Pete's younger brother. He held out his hand and spoke to his brother. "Pete, after all I've done to you, after all this time, I can't believe you'd still reach out to me. You're right. It's time to bury the hatchet." The two brothers met in the middle of the bridge and embraced. They turned to see the carpenter hoist his toolbox on his shoulder. "No, wait, stay a few days," they said. "I've got other projects for you. I got other ways that I can use you." "I'd love to stay," the carpenter said, "but I have a lot more bridges to build." Over the last 3 Sundays, our journey through Genesis has been one that I hope has been filled with revelation. We have heard that God goes to great lengths to covenant with a particular people for the redemption of the world through Abraham and Sarah. God offers a kind of scandalous goodness towards Abraham and Sarah's offspring as their journey towards becoming a great nation. And despite all the dysfunction and the barrenness, all the deception and despair, God is faithful in his covenant. For it is by God's grace which provides a power to be free of worry, free of worry and fear, to be able to go out into this world that our God created and calls us to be a part of. So it may seem a bit odd to share a sermon on the power of God's goodness when we've looked at it. In fact, it may seem odd not to focus on God's grace shed on thee or on what it means to be a phenomenal place, a phenomenal people. But that's not what it means to focus and highlight on God's goodness. In fact, one of the greatest characters to look at in Genesis is that of Joseph. Now, the story of Joseph comprises more space in the book of Genesis than any other collection of stories about a central figure. In fact, verses 37 to 50, the last third of the book of Genesis, is all about Joseph and how God worked through him despite all the pitfalls and difficulties he had. Now, it starts out where he is the beloved child out of 11 brothers. You see, his father had 2 wives. The first one was Leah, whom he got tricked into marrying, and he had 10 sons through him. And then there was his other wife, Rachel, whom he adored, that he only had Joseph. Joseph was the youngest, and when he was born, his father, he basically put him up on a pedestal, treated him like he was the crowned prince, which in this culture and this day and time, and to many third world cultures to this day, the eldest son is the one who gets the lion's share of the father's blessings, not the youngest. In fact, the younger you are, the more you serve the older siblings, the more duty you have dropped on you, both in responsibility and crud of life. Yes, there's a play on words there. When you get it, you can laugh whenever you like. But Joseph wasn't treated like that. He was the one whom his father would give the greatest portions at the meals. He was the one whom his father would take aside and have special times. While the brothers were out tending the fields and taking care of the flocks, Joseph was at home with his father, learning his father's intimate knowledge and intimate secrets that was being deprived to his other elder brothers, who a lot of them now were married and had their own families, and still responsible under the leadership and guidance of great old dad. One day, they'd had enough. And they took Joseph, whom was sent to check on them by their dad, and threw him in a pit, sold him into slavery, and then went home with his outer garment, his coat of many colors, a beautiful ceremonial robe that would be given to someone of high office and someone who you should respect greatly, covered it in animal's blood and saying, "Your son's been killed," throwing his father into a massive depth of grief. Now, you'd think that this would take Joseph, who was maybe 12 or 13 at the time, maybe a little older, and basically destroy him. But that started Joseph on a series of events that helped him grow and to prosper. He was sold into slavery, became part of Potiphar's house, and became someone who Potiphar trusted with his most precious treasures. You see, you wouldn't trust that to anyone unless you knew that they would not do you wrong any under circumstance. We're talking about unquestionable integrity. Well, Potiphar's wife kind of got a thing for Joseph, kind of chased him. Joseph politely said, "No, thank you." And she said that he tried to take advantage of her. What happens? He lands up in jail. While there, in the beginning, he was treated like a common prisoner. But in time, the prison guards and the people in charge of the prison recognized that there was something a little more to Joseph, something special about him. And they started giving him responsibilities slowly over time, to the point that he was in charge of a lot of responsibilities within the prison. But he was also given a gift by God, the ability to interpret dreams. And he did this of two imprisoned palace staff members. One was a steward, one was a cook. What I mean by a steward, a wine tasting steward. They were troubled, and he interpreted their dreams, and he told them what they meant, and he said, "Hey, remember me if the opportunity comes to get me out of here sooner than later." And they said, "Okay." Well, one of them, their dream came true, and they were executed. The other one, the dream came true when they were basically reinstalled to their office within the palace. And a lot of time went by. And then Pharaoh became troubled. And he had nightmares. And all of a sudden, the steward remembered Joseph and says, "There's a guy, he's in the prison. He might be able to help you out, because none of your other smart people that work for you and cow down to have pretty much been able to give you any clarity." And the Pharaoh went, "Sure." Joseph shows up, hears what the nightmares are, and explains to the Pharaoh what it is. Something in that interaction attracted the Pharaoh to realize that here was someone who was special. And he not only freed him from prison, but the only person's authority in the entire Egyptian kingdom and empire that could go over Joseph's was that of Pharaoh himself. He made him the second in command of the entire nation and put together a massive plan to basically take their time of plenty and save up in stores, because a time of famine would come. Now, there are a number of years that pass within all of this, and what we notice is that during this time, Joseph seriously grows up. He goes from being a person of entitled position, the apple of daddy's eye, the resentment of all of his brothers, to the most respected person in the land of Egypt next to the Pharaoh. From nothing to something. God carried him through every moment of tragedy with all the gifts that he'd been given to be this prime minister, so to speak, over all the land. Well, the famine eventually hit, and it didn't hit just Egypt, but it hit all of that Middle Eastern region. And in time, the 10 brothers recognized under their father's leadership that they had a famine. They couldn't feed the household. They couldn't keep the animals alive. And animals was more precious than silver and gold. So the father said, okay, you 10, go down to Egypt, see if you can buy some grain from the Egyptians. They do. And when they come before Joseph, they don't recognize him. You see, he doesn't look like Joseph, I'm blanking on the name. Doesn't look like their brother. We'll just put it that way. I don't have my glasses on and my notes are a little fuzzy. I haven't adjusted to the distance yet. Sorry? Yeah, it's Jacob. But his name gets changed to Israel later on. Anyway. Sends them down to buy some food. They don't recognize Joseph. He's not the same person. He's grown up. But instead of looking like the child of Jacob, he looks like an Egyptian noble figure. So speaking through an interpreter, Joe says, hey, what do you want? Well, we're here to buy food. Nope, I think you're spies. And he puts them in jail for a few days. They go back before him and they go, no, we're not. We're here genuinely to buy food. Here's our money. We'd like to purchase it and go home. And Joseph goes, okay. So he fills their bags with grains, put the money back in it, and sends them on their way. They didn't know the money was returned to them until they stopped for the night to feed their animals. And they found the bags of silver in each of the grain sacks. They go home. They eat up the stores, and the famine gets worse. So they have to go back to Egypt this time. Now they go back, and things are a little different. This time, Joseph says, tell me about your family. Is your father still alive? Strange for a foreign noble dignitary to ask such a personal question when their job is to conduct business and protect the affairs of the native land, in this case, Egypt. Tell me how your dad's doing. He's fine. What other family do you have at home? We have a younger brother at home, Benjamin. Now, you haven't seen your family, your siblings, your parental unit, let's say for at least 2 decades. Haven't had any form of communication. All you've had is the opportunity to talk to God and say, boy, I hope they're all well. Now you find out you have a little brother that you knew nothing about. So he kind of says, well, I'd like to meet him. You need to go get him. In fact, one of your brothers can stick around here while you go get him. And they kind of went, and Simeon's the one that gets chosen to stay behind. Fills the bags with the grain, puts the silver back in the bag, sends them home, tells the father, he wants us to come back, this Egyptian official, but we got to bring Benjamin. Jacob has a cat right on the spot. I mean, a fit and rage. His heart is breaking open again because he lost his beloved son Joseph, the first son born of his beloved Rachel, and now he's going to have to lose his second one. He's not going to do that. It ain't going to happen. He says, we're not talking about this anymore, and they eat the food. And the stores run out, and they have to go back to Egypt. And this time, Benjamin goes with them. This is where it gets interesting. When they show up, Joseph says, hey, come to my house for dinner. These are two strange, significant events. First, how's your family? Do you have anyone else you left at home? Second, third time around now, hey, come to my house for a meal. They are scared out of their gourds. They've been accused of being spies. They've been accused of not being honest. But at the same time, not only had they been given the food that they came to purchase to make sure that their family stayed living, but they were also given their money back. What is with this fella that they're dealing with? He's making no sense. He's being direct. He could be viewed as being a little harsh, but then he turns around as an abundantly gracious by not taking anything from them. So they go, they have the meal, and Joseph asks more personal questions. But this time, with each personal round of questions, when he gets the answers, he immediately gets up and leaves the room because he cannot let them see his emotional breakdown that he's having. His sibling feelings, his love for his brothers, his love for his father is starting to grow to a point that he may not be able to contain it much longer. So he goes back in and he says, okay, take your stuff, go on your way, have a great one. But he says to one of his servants, you see my little precious drinky cup here that I have? Stick it in Benjamin's bag. They do as he's told. The brothers get up and leave, still have no idea who they're dealing with. And when they stop for the night, they are caught up by the palace guards who says, y'all are thieves. They're like, we haven't done anything. Go through our bags of grain. You won't find anything. They go through all the brothers, get to Benny's, rip it open. There's the special silver drinking cup thingy. Turn around, have to go back. In this conversation and interaction, this grilling and this defense, Joseph can't hold it in no longer, and he dismisses all the Egyptian servants in the room, and he looks at his brothers and say, guess what? I'm Joseph. Have you ever run into someone who you haven't seen for a very long time, and they look very different, and they talk very different, and they act very different? And they say, you know, I'm the guy that used to make mud pies with you and throw them at your little sister, or brother, or neighbor's dog, or the garage just because you wanted to see it go splat. And you kind of sit there and you go, and then there's something within the person's face, a mannerism, how they breathe, how they sneeze, how their left ear looks. It doesn't matter, but the light clicks on and you realize, oh my word, this is the individual. That's what happened to the brothers when they realized that this person who they'd been dealing with all along was the one whom they had treated so poorly, had hated, would do anything to get them out of their way so they could have their father's favor. They're related. You're alive, you're not dead. Holy cow, we're not going to go to the bad place of the underworld when we die. We've been saved, we'll be blessed, everything will be fine. And Joseph says, I want to see Dad. Go get him. Bring him back. In fact, I will give you a land to live in where you will not have to worry, where you will not have to suffer. You can basically stay there until this famine passes. And they do. They go home. They get Dad. They come back. And a beautiful family reunion takes place. Jacob is able to see the son that he had lost one last time. So his heart, his soul, and his mind could be whole, could be complete. And so he could die in peace, not of a broken heart. But when Jacob dies is probably the most tense element of this story. And I'm going to pick it up at verse 15 in Genesis. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg of you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong that they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of God, of your father." And then Joseph wept when they spoke to them. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. I am in the place of God. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing right now, here, today, in this moment. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. If Joseph was able to wait so many years, from failure to prosperity, from failure to prosperity, from failure to prosperity, here was a person who understood the long game tactic of patience. And in time, you can get back at those who have done you wrong. It's not the people who take immediate action or reaction to an adverse situation. It's those who quietly percolate, scheme, plot, quietly build allies. And then when they've waited long enough and they think that you're at your most vulnerable, they attack and take you down. It could be argued that tactic was in the minds of the brothers, that this is what Joseph was doing, because daddy was no longer there to protect them. Little brother, who was now more powerful than anyone in the land except the Pharaoh himself, could in the blink of an eye and the snap of his fingers eliminate their existence from the globe, and there would be no record of it. That's the level of cruelty they have plotted in their minds of how their lives are about to change because of what they did so many years ago. And Joseph basically says, "I hold you in no bondage of what you've done before. I have forgiven you, so I will not hold you accountable for those actions. In fact, I will take care of you. Because what you meant to destroy, God has built up. What you have meant to be negative and turned into nothing, God in his grand goodness has turned into something beautiful, something that has power, something that has grace, something that can give life. And it's all because we have this great and awesome God. It's not because I've been lucky. It's because God has been intentionally involved in my life, and I have abided within it." Jacob had passed. It was now falling to the brothers to carry on the tradition. But one of them had to look out for them. One of them had to protect them. One of them had to guide them. And knowing that the first eldest brothers of Leah were not looked upon favorably by the father, they were never taught by Jacob how to be a loving, caring person. There was always an element of resentment going on. Why that was the case, I will never know. Genesis doesn't tell us. But Genesis does tell us how Joseph was prepared. Joseph understood what it meant to grow. Joseph understood what it meant to struggle. Joseph understood what it meant to overcome any and all obstacles that this world and the people of the world can throw at us. And the same goodness of God that carried Joseph through that period of time of growth and struggle, growth and struggle, growth and struggle, is the same God that created the heavens and the earth. is the same God who created the covenant with Abraham and Sarah, who took lifelessness and put life there, is the same God who sent his Son into this world so all of us could know what it means to walk with a God of goodness, not the idea of a deity who uses our life for their own pleasure. That was the pagan idea. That is also the idea of, what did I do wrong for God to punish me? But if you believe that God is a whole and good God, then that's not how God works. God takes the broken, the defeat, the overwhelmed, the I don't like, even the people that say, I will not conform, and can use them to reveal, to purport, and to portray the goodness of God's love in our lives, not merely moment by moment, but when you look back in time, you can see year by year by year by year. The place where we felt most defeated, God was there building the bridges so we could celebrate a victory. In the places where we felt our greatest divide, God's goodness was building the bridges to all wholeness to move forward, but in a better, stronger way than it did before. The times when we feel like we have no honking clue. We are so lost and so desperate for something. God is there building bridges, even when we do not see the post being sunk and the foundations being poured. So that when we get to the place of realization, we can sit there and celebrate God's goodness has been there right all along. Joseph is a beautifully phenomenal example of what this looks like. I think every church can be the same thing, if we allow ourselves to be open to experience that which we need to experience, to go through the journey of that which we need to go through, to not sweep it under the rug, but to look it straight in the eye and say, okay, God, how do we handle this? To look at adversity and diversity and understand where the Spirit is telling us to stand and how the Spirit is calling us to come together. If the goodness of God can work through Joseph to save a nation that would become the elements in which the Savior is brought into this world, then why won't God use that same goodness to work through us to rebuild the mission and purpose and calling that we all have to go forward in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit? You see, it not only happened to Abraham and Sarah, but it happened through Abraham and Sarah. It not only happened to Joseph, but the goodness of God, the blessings of God, the hope of God also happened through Joseph. God's presence and love not only happens to us, people of God, in this room, but that goodness is also meant to flow through us as well.